and how art helps mitigate that through social theory and behavioral theory and psychodynamic theory. But what I eventually settled on, which is my own personal theoretical position, was relying on a social interactionist perspective. The very act of creating art, giving a sense of self, using art as a means of healthy social interaction, that accepting one's art from someone helps mitigate the frustration and that they may experience through not being accepted by others, which, if unexpressed or unaccepted, may result in aggressive and violent tendencies. So, to me, social interaction was a wonderful umbrella to encompass object relations, psychodynamic perspectives, cognitive behavioral theories, neurobiological. So, whichever psychological theory you subscribe to, the social interaction theory says that may be where it's come from, but this is how it can be mitigated and resolved.
When I look at an artist like Picasso, and I know that he's on your list, there are particular instances where his work was really influenced by acts of violence. And I think of when he was a very young man, the events associated with his best friend Casagemas, committing suicide in the course of an attempted murder. And then, of course, probably one of the world's greatest paintings, Guernica, which is associated with the atrocities of the Spanish Civil War. Maybe you could just kind of speak to, some of the particular events that you saw affecting some of these specific artists that you looked at, and maybe how their work was fundamentally changed based on how they were affected.
First off, I think it's wonderful that you bring up Guernica. That is actually chapter 7, called Guernica, Painted from Violence, a Palette for Peace, in which two art educators used the Guernica template as a way to reach children all over the world who are dealing with aggression and violence in their countries of origin, who are experiencing peace-shattering events, and using the very model to help bring people together and create these works. So I think what you're hitting upon became fundamental in the book later on as I was developing it, which is, if I really and truly subscribe to a social interaction perspective, then I need to recognize that there are contexts in all of this where people are interacting not only with each other, but within the time that they live in. So, of course, when we talk about the Renaissance, people think that Renaissance was all enlightenment and wonderfully bright and airy. Quite frankly, it was a time of violence and chaos. And so when you have, all the way up through the Baroque period, so you've got Caravaggio, of course, in the Baroque period, and you've got early on Donatello and Michelangelo and Da Vinci, who were in and of themselves demonstrating violent tendencies. And that was because of who they were and where they were. That was socially acceptable. Cellini bragged about his acts because, again, it was what construed masculinity and strength in his own autobiography. And of course, Salvador Dali, who's living in a time that is utterly bereft of humanity through the development of World War II and toxic masculinity and this tendency of celebrating his own sense of superiority. It becomes part of his identity and becomes part of his work. We don't even know if the things that he wrote about in his autobiography are true or not. It's just that he knows his audience, and he knows that the way to sell it is to present himself as this toxically violent and misogynistic person. Picasso, his libidinal demonstrations through his art, I would say, dovetail into his way of controlling or sublimating these aggressive and violent tendencies that he saw. It was just a different act of violence that he may perpetrate.
So when we look at the serial killers in the book, do you find that they were drawn to creating art, or was the art something that was offered to them and something that they took up that offer and were kind of making it because it was something that they could do? Or were they really driven by a creative process? And what does their work, what does it reflect? Does that make sense as a question?
it makes sense as a series of questions, I think, because there's a lot to really untangle there. Because my colleague Jack Levine, who specializes in working with serial killers, and Catherine Ramsland, who I've often corresponded with, they specialize in serial killers, and even they, I think, would argue that there's really no way to tell what's going on inside their heads, and that the art itself will not always reflect that. If I had to choose one of the multiple murderers who really was driven to create and did so as an accurate portrayal of what he was feeling inside, may have been Charles Manson, who long before he had been arrested was trying to create music and create drawings and paintings. They were unusual, and they weren't what you would call aesthetically pleasing. But I will say that he had tried to be known as an artist before he was actually arrested. Whereas I would argue that people like John-Wayne-Gacy, people like Rawling, people like Ing, even to a certain extent Ramirez, but I think that's a different type of scenario. They took advantage of the already existing fascination that we have in the United States towards murder, or actually worldwide, towards murderabilia. This notion of that we're fascinated by the artifacts of those that have killed others. I had several conversations with Mirko out in Berlin, who ran a gallery where he collected artworks of multiple murderers. And the fascination that we have as a culture towards murderabilia is astounding. And I would, and there's a section in this book that kind of takes that apart. And I would argue that people like Gacy and Ing and Rowling and Bowles took advantage of this fascination. Gacy's case, he did so to try and recreate a sense of self so that he would seem more accepted as a way to rehumanize his image. It didn't work. Obviously, his work was quite banal. But even like people like Rowling and Bowles, who saw that there was a fascination for this, and this is just, of course, my own theoretical perspectives, right? I mean, who's to say what they actually thought? But their work, which is also bereft of real connection and emotion, continued to keep people at a distance by the way it was done, but knowing full well that there would be an audience for it through the murderabilia. So there's a perpetuation of their own sense of superiority and grandiosity and control and power, which is really what all of this comes down to. So it's just so of all of the artists that I saw who were multiple murderers, I would say the only person who I think genuinely tried to be an artist for artist's sake and still did not succeed was Manson.
In art criticism, we often talk about the viewer's share, about how painting is completed by an artist with whatever intent, but the viewer brings their own baggage to viewing a work. As somebody who studies, the world of psychology, what does it say about us that we're attracted to artists that are parsing this sort of trauma? What does it say about us that we're attracted to murderabilia?
I think depending on the theoretical position, you could use all sorts of vocabulary, but certainly I think what it does is that it reveals for us our own shadow side. There, but by the grace of God, go I. There's, the notion that the piece of work that we see, what is separating us from them? And there's that fascination of what is it that person had that I did not have, or vice versa. And we're fascinated by the art. We almost become virtual rubberneckers when we look at the artwork of such people, because we're fascinated trying to look for the message in this art. And the reality is, when the art's not going to reveal who this is, the same way that you could look at these pieces and see that the next door neighbor may do a similar piece. We're fascinated by its own, it attracts us or reflects our own, like I said, our own shadow, our own dark side. It's almost a release for some of us, let them be our avatar, so to speak. Let them be the extension of our own psyche, because they're the ones who are going to get caught and get in trouble for it. It's kind of dark. Can we? We should end this on an optimistic
No,
note.
no. Well, let's end it on talking about art therapy. I've been in the art world for a long time, and I never took an art therapy course in college. I think my audience would probably benefit from having somebody in your position kind of give us a thumbnail of the precepts of art therapy and what we know and how we use it for therapeutic purposes.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great question. And again, I want to stress that of all my books and articles that I've done, this is not an art therapy book. There's an art therapy chapter in it. The final chapter is an art therapy chapter, but a colleague did indicate when I was talking about this work, it may not be an art therapy book, but it takes an art therapist to write it. And I would have to concur with that. And the art therapy, which has been around for as a professional field for more than 50 years, but as a concept for 70, 80 years. And this notion that there's the process of art making, which is that we can sublimate our energy, our psychic energy into the art forms, that certain materials and media may facilitate expression and fluidity and explosion or containment and safety and cognitive reflection and affective response and a kinesthetic energy that may provide release or a sensory relationship to it that may tap into certain functions. And so the process of art making is extremely viable and valuable. And on the other side of that, continuum is the product, the final piece itself, which may on one level have certain formal elements that reflect accessible material about what that person may be expressing or feeling at that time, as well as providing a catalyst for discussion by the artist or the creator, because oftentimes they may not even know what is going on inside them until they get it out and they put it on the art form. And all of a sudden, upon reflecting on this art form, they see what that piece is reflecting back for them. Our job as art therapists are facilitators. We don't read the art. We don't put meaning onto the art. It becomes, although we're part of the transferential relationship, that we are just the facilitators to be the people that help them along that journey of discovery.
As an art therapist, do you provide a prompt or is it just materials? Is there kind of a pathway that you kind of lead them down for their own sense of self-discovery? Or is there a little bit more pointed prompts to kind of open some doors?
I'm going to say yes to all of that because it really depends on who we work with. I mean, I specialize in working with prison inmates and those in juvenile justice settings and gang members. And so I value the nonverbal quality of the art making because, of course, inside such institutions, any type of admission of vulnerability and weakness or illness may be taken advantage of by others. And so the art provides a means for us working behind the mask that exists for them, for their own survival. So that's the process of art making, depending on how we may offer certain processes, certain suggestions, certain materials that may bring along the trajectory of care. But we have, I have graduate students that have come through this program here at Florida State who work in all sorts of different environments, everything from preschool all the way to hospice care, working in medical facilities, community centers, working in psychiatric facilities, substance abuse treatment facilities, everything and anything. We've been there. And what we do is we adapt to the needs of our clients, the types of materials that we'll offer, perhaps the directives or the group dynamics that we'll suggest or promote. And through a trajectory, be it short-term or long-term, bring them along the art process to help facilitate healing, wellness, rapprochement, again, depending on your vocabulary or theory.
When you work with people in prison and they are new to art therapy, in terms of those masks, do you see those first interactions, them making work that has more machismo and vibrato, and over time become more vulnerable? Or are they open to that vulnerability from the beginning?
That's an excellent question. there already is a style reminiscent of what we would call a jailhouse style. And so you've certainly seen those types of images that may very well, and we worked in women's prisons and men's prisons.